2.7 million people who, joining them, were the leaders, the heads of state.
Liberté, égalité, fraternité.
Largest demonstration in France since France was liberated from the Nazis.
A big moment for Islam, a big moment for Muslims.
Charlie Hebdo had disappeared from the newsstands across Paris.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories that we've been tracking this week. Charlie Hebdo, back on the newsstands. A political who's who comes out in support. But of what, exactly? Now they subpoena him, now they don't. The curious case of the New York Times reporter, the CIA, and the American justice system. Hollywood, hackers, and the Hermit Kingdom. The story behind the story of that comedy that turned into a serious issue. And Murdochian logic not going down well on Twitter. Charlie Hebdo produced another edition of its magazine this past week. The staff says it has distributed 5 million copies, a print run 80 times higher than normal. The official estimates of the size of that unity rally in Paris, upwards of 1.5 million people, would make it the biggest demonstration in French history. Those numbers are indicative of how powerfully invested millions are in the value of freedom of speech and the affront that the murder of those journalists and the police trying to protect them represents. Grief is a powerful emotion, one that political leaders have been known to exploit. The rally was, among other things, a grade A photo opportunity, but some of the presidents, prime ministers, and ambassadors who stood shoulder to shoulder in Paris, symbolizing their commitment to freedom of expression, have at home turned their backs on the very same ideals. Twitter was alight with Turks, Egyptians, and Russians, among others, calling out their governments for that hypocrisy. The debates taking place around this story come in myriad forms: news conferences, editorials, blogs, broadcasts, and evermore cartoons. And making sense of one of the dominant themes in the news coverage, that civil society must confront an enemy within, is complicated by the fact that nobody really seems to know who that enemy is. Our starting point this week, once again, is Paris. In a story that, when boiled down to its essence, is about the power of images and the way those images are perceived, this one speaks volumes. Political leaders on a Paris street being seen defending freedom of expression. Among them, the Prime Minister of Turkey, which is one of the world's leading jailers of journalists, and the foreign ministers of Russia and Egypt, where freedom of the press and freedom of expression are both quaint notions since dispensed with. There are photo opportunities, then there are photo opportunists.
The march was important for the French people to kind of grieve in a way, to kind of come to terms with what had happened, but at the same time it highlighted some hypocrisy in the fact that many of these leaders have been quite rightly criticized over the past few years for actually not being real defenders of freedom of speech.
There's no other motivation than political expediency. I'm not surprised. These are politicians, they have careers and they have agendas, and they want to get on board. The other thing is that Western governments themselves have used terrorism as a means by which to curtail and diminish not just freedom of speech, but all sorts of other freedoms as well, in the name of a security agenda. And there's an irony in that, if not a contradiction.
However, Senegal's president, Macky Sall, may have outdone his peers in Paris. Having established his freedom of expression credentials in the land of liberté, he flew back to Dakar, where his government quickly banned not just Charlie Hebdo, but also Libération, a French newspaper whose title requires no translating. When Charlie Hebdo published what it called its Survivors Edition on Wednesday, news organizations were faced yet again with a dilemma: to show or not to show.
Because you're not even showing it. It's this, which is completely crazy, that in UK you cannot show a simple drawing as that. With Mohammed
here at Sky News, we've chosen not to show that cover.
As Charlie Hebdo covers go, this one seemed intended to be less incendiary than the most notorious ones, showing the Muslim prophet with a sign saying, "Je suis Charlie."
On one hand, it's incredibly important that Charlie Hebdo was not silenced by this attack. On the other hand, I take issue even with the cover depiction. It continues to propagate racist depictions of Arabs. I mean, Prophet Muhammad is only Prophet Muhammad to Muslims. To anyone else, he's just an Arab man in history. And so to present an Arab man with a hooked nose, why is that any less offensive than if it was the depiction of a Jewish man with a hooked nose. That would be considered utterly outrageous. It wouldn't be celebrated, it would be condemned.
It's almost as if they couldn't help themselves. It's like saying, well, actually, we understand that not all Muslims agree with what these people did, but at the same time, we'll still rub your face in it, because we can. And it almost feels like, because we can, we must. It's very, very sad, because it does feel to me like we're just waltzing into a dynamic where there's no middle ground possible.
Le 11 septembre des Français.
Characterizing the Paris shootings as the French 9/11, as some news outlets have, was as inevitable as it was disproportionate. However, there are echoes of 2001, 2002 in the rhetoric on the airwaves, similar doses of misinformation being administered.
And in Britain, it's not just no-go zones. There are actual cities like Birmingham that are totally Muslim, where non-Muslims just simply don't go in. And
Fox calls this man a terrorism expert. Prime Minister Cameron, who tends to choose his words with care, called him a complete idiot. Another American journalist, more widely traveled and better informed than most, went on CNN to say that the false expertise syndrome is by no means limited to Fox News.
I also think that CNN and MSNBC and Fox are engaging in the terrorism expert industrial complex, where you have people on as paid analysts that are largely frauds who have made a lot of money off of portraying themselves as terror experts and really don't have the scholarly background or on-the-ground experience to justify being on your network or any other network.
Al Jazeera was another network to have its coverage turn into a debate, including within. An email from one executive producer was eventually leaked, revealing a variety of opinions and approaches to the story. Media watchers soaked it all up.
The leak of Al Jazeera emails shows that even within one organization, people have various views and opinions over what constitutes or not freedom of expression, about where the line should be drawn. And the fact that it generated so much media coverage also shows the media's interest in covering the media.
In a way, it should be seen as a healthy sign that disagreement can take place in an editorial room. And I think it's very important that these debates take place. And I mean, it would seem quite hypocritical as well for a lot of the media who have been defending freedom of speech to then attack people who actually are dissenting.
And that gets to the heart of the bigger story, one that lies well beyond the pseudo-experts peddling beliefs instead of knowledge, beyond the circulation figures of a single magazine, or the show of solidarity, the photo op that cynical leaders reduced to a caricature just by showing up. There are bigger issues attached to this story that are not getting the coverage they deserve.
Actually, the real threat to freedom of speech in Europe increasingly comes less from, I think, for terrorists in this case, and more so from the reactions from our governments, the sort of legislation that's being brought in that increasingly seeks to curb free speech in the name of some sort of exceptionalism justified through terrorism. And I think that's really where the concern should lie.
The fact is, there is a debate to be had about when it is right to publish offensive material and when it's not right. Everybody has the right. That's not an issue. That's the simplest thing in the world to say. The next question is the hard question. When is it right to exercise that right to freedom of speech? And if we can't now have a debate about the proper limits of freedom of speech without appearing to be disloyal to freedom of speech, and we're heading into very, very dangerous waters if we can't do that, because if you can't debate freedom of speech, well then that's an irony, isn't it?
On the download this week, our viewers and what they make of the coverage of the ongoing developments in Paris.
Retweeting Charlie Hebdo cartoons fails to address the contextual issues in France. It creates a polarised view of them, being the Muslims, and us. Historically, satire has been used as a tool to criticise those in a position of power. Sharing bigoted images of a religious figure is offence for offence's sake. And given the systematic marginalisation of Muslims in France and the West, this creates a toxic environment.
A lot of people have been and will be insulted by Charlie Hebdo's content, and of course, and also, so what? There's no reason why Islam can't be mocked as much as any other religion. If Hebdo was a purely anti-Islamic magazine, this would be a completely different story. However, a simple web search will show you how they attack every faith for all of their backwards views, which is an honourable attempt, in my opinion, to modernise our world and bring these issues to the forefront.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week. In a bizarre, confusing conclusion to an already complicated case, U.S. prosecutors who tried and failed to get a New York Times reporter to reveal his sources in a CIA whistleblowing case are now trying to force him not to testify. The reporter is James Risen, and the accused in the case is CIA employee Jeffrey Sterling, who was charged with revealing a secret U.S. program to provide Iran with faulty plans for a nuclear bomb. Federal prosecutors and the Office of the Attorney General both issued Risen with subpoenas ordering him to testify in the criminal trial, and they were backed by a Supreme Court ruling. Risen, who has always maintained that he would rather go to jail than give up his source, refused again this past week, and prosecutors finally gave up trying. But when Sterling's defense team revealed it wanted Risen to testify on some other legal points, the same prosecutors who had tried to force him to answer their questions then asked the judge to bar Risen from the witness stand altogether. Strip away all of the legal maneuverings, and Risen's lawyer said of the case, the significance of this goes beyond Jim Risen. It affects journalists everywhere. Journalists need to be able to uphold that confidentiality in order to do their jobs. A Saudi blogger already serving a 10-year prison sentence has endured a public flogging, the first of many, in Jeddah. A video emerged online apparently showing Raif Badawi being lashed in a public square. He got 50 lashes and has another 950 coming. Badawi ran a website called the Saudi Liberal Network. It's been taken offline by the Saudi authorities, but when it was active, it sarcastically ridiculed the country's cultural restrictions, including a prohibition against Valentine's Day, which, like all non-Muslim holidays, is banned in Saudi Arabia. Badawi's lawyer has also been sentenced to 15 years in prison for insulting the judiciary, inciting public opinion, and undermining the government and its officials. Sarah Whiston of Human Rights Watch, which is based in New York, said of the twin cases, these prosecutions show just how sensitive the Saudi authorities have become to the ability of ordinary citizens to voice opinions online that the government considers controversial or taboo. Instead of pursuing their peaceful online critics, Saudi officials would be better employed in carrying out much-needed reforms. We've reported before on Jimmy Lai, the Hong Kong media magnate, having his home searched by the authorities there. Now his home and one of his offices have been firebombed. Security cameras outside Lai's house show a masked man pulling into the driveway this past week, throwing what appears to be a Molotov cocktail. No one was hurt, and the vehicle was later found on fire with its license plates removed. Jimmy Lai's office in another part of the city was simultaneously targeted. No one has claimed responsibility for either attack. Last month, Lai stepped down as the chairman of Next Media, which publishes Apple Daily and Next Magazine, outlets known for their critical reporting of the Chinese government. Jimmy Lai was also front and center at the recent Hong Kong pro-democracy protests. Lai's spokesperson later told Agence France Presse that violence and intimidation seem to be the ongoing currency for those opposed to democracy and free press. There is no other plausible explanation here. Justice Secretary Rimsky-Yuen also condemned the attack, saying regardless of who the target is, Hong Kong, as a city with rule of law, definitely does not tolerate this. It's taken us longer than we would have liked to get to this next story because other news kept getting in the way, but we think it's still worth examining because of what it says about intelligence matters and the way that journalists report them. It's the story of that Hollywood movie, The Interview, North Korea, and the hacking of Sony Pictures, which made news and a fair amount of gossip all around the world. By now, you probably know the plot has a couple of American journalists recruited by the CIA to kill North Korea's supreme leader, Kim Jong-un. Just days before the film was to premiere in cinemas, Sony Pictures pulled it, fearing, quote, 9/11-style attacks, unquote, on theaters that showed it. The threat came from a group of hackers that had already caused havoc with a cyber attack on Sony Pictures and leaked reams of the studio's confidential information. Washington was quick to blame the hack on North Korea, and many in the U.S. news media could not wait to do the same. The New York Times and the Washington Post were among the news outlets that once again quoted anonymous intelligence officials pointing the finger, despite consistent denials from North Korea, as well as a chorus of cyber experts who were beyond dubious. Pyongyang's official response to the film, that releasing it would amount to an act of war, also struck people as a reach. But when you consider the way that the country's been depicted by Hollywood, and then take a closer look at what was actually revealed in the hack job on Sony Pictures, you may reconsider. The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now on how a screwball comedy turned into a serious story that failed to get the coverage that its seriousness deserved.
Please tell me you know that that's a stupid idea.
Forget for a moment that this story started with a movie. Set aside, for now, the cyber theft angle, that Sony had its communications stolen by hackers unknown. And park the whole freedom of expression argument. It can be a distraction. The real story is about intelligence and how the Western media tends to report on it.
The feds have determined who is to blame.
The president acknowledging North Korea is behind it.
Regardless of whether the story is in the Far East or the Middle East.
The media immediately accepted the narrative, the FBI narrative, that North Korea was responsible for the hacking. We've seen this kind of script before. We've seen the United States government present an intelligence profile of a country and then expect the world to fall into lockstep with that account. In 2003, then Secretary of State Colin Powell presented what he claimed was an airtight case that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction before the UN Security Council.
I believe this conclusion is irrefutable and undeniable.
The same thing happened in the Vietnam War with the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where the NSA essentially told the military and the civilian leadership that the North Vietnamese had attacked the United States, when in fact they had not.
We believe at least 2 of the attacking boats were sunk.
And so I think it's important for the media to be very careful and scrutinize government claims like this very carefully.
We can confirm that North Korea engaged in this attack.
Or we could end up in a situation like these past situations where we react too quickly and realize that we have attacked an actor that may not have been involved.
Pyongyang has repeatedly denied that it was behind the hack on Sony, which in and of itself is not enough to throw off even the most gullible journalist. But then there are the numerous cyber experts who have picked apart the evidence against North Korea. And if that's not cause for a bit of skepticism, then take a look at the initial demands of the Guardians of Peace, the group that claimed responsibility for the hack.
The Guardians of Peace never even mentioned the interview for 3 weeks, and only the first instance in which they mentioned the film was to say that the interview had nothing to do with why they hacked into Sony.
The hackers initially were trying to extort money from Sony. They had nothing to say at all about North Korea or the interview until the media brought it up more than a week later. Once a reporter was asking questions as to whether this hack was connected to the interview, then the hackers started making demands that the studio pull the movie from theaters and not distribute it online.
And so the movie itself has become a central theme. You know, who's to tell us that we can't create a movie with a plot line like this? Who's to tell us where and when we can show this kind of a movie? That being said, I think it's really important to keep in mind that as sacrosanct and as legitimate as the right to free expression is, you also have a responsibility to at least consider the implications of your speech.
Seth Rogen, the interview's director and co-star, claims that the film was not meant to be controversial. However, read the hacked Sony emails. They will tell you a different story. The hack revealed that Sony had enlisted the services of Bruce Bennett, a senior defense analyst at the RAND Corporation. The RAND Corporation was set up after World War II when the Pentagon decided that it needed a private organization to link military planning with research and development decisions. Ever since, RAND has played a key role in formulating a number of US policies. In an exchange in June last year with Sony's CEO, Michael Linton, Bennett opposed toning down the film's controversial ending, saying, "I have been clear that an assassination of Kim Jong-un is the most likely path to a collapse of the North Korean government," adding that the film will start some real thinking. In response, Linton wrote, "Bruce spoke to someone very senior in the state, confidentially. He agreed with everything you've been saying. Everything."
The RAND Corporation has very close ties to U.S. officials. And I think it's the whole point of why there was this interaction and contact between U.S. government officials and the RAND Corporation and Sony, and that all parties review this movie as not mere entertainment, but as having the potential of inspiring regime change.
Bruce Bennett, his major thesis has been, for the past few years, that the way to make the North Korean government collapse is to take out its leadership. So in other words, a plot line that is eerily similar to that which we see in the interview.
If that email is in fact true, it tells me that the producers of the film and executives at Sony Corporation understood, at least to some extent, that the plot line was provocative, would be provocative to North Korea, and in particular the regime there.
And one thing that I would also mention is the fact that Michael Linton, who's the CEO of Sony Entertainment, is actually on the board of trustees of RAND Corporation. So you see this very intimate relationship between Sony and the military-industrial complex.
Coming back to the freedom of expression argument, it boils down to two very different perspectives. Despite the threat of violence, US theaters were reportedly packed with moviegoers who were off to see a film described by its director as very silly because they said it was their patriotic duty. In North Korea, the state broadcaster was calling the interview an act of terrorism.
For the general population, the leadership in North Korea is deified. They're like a god. And to have, imagine if you will, a film where the Prophet Muhammad or a film where Jesus Christ was considered a target for assassination, you would offend an awful lot of people. And so that kind of cognitive dissonance within North Korea would not be helpful, would certainly be destabilizing.
Look, I think any time that somebody feels threatened enough to not speak, then that is a freedom of expression issue. You know, in the United States, we call it the heckler's veto, that something isn't spoken because of its content, but because we're afraid of the reaction. And that should never be the case.
Without the controversy attached, the biggest reaction to the interview would have come from film critics, and they probably wouldn't have been kind. But a combination of circumstances, flawed reporting and misplaced patriotism turned the film into a geopolitical football, a must-watch for many Americans, and an unlikely hit online. If we could ask the hackers one question, it would be, who's laughing now? But, as usual, they were unavailable for comment.
More voices on the download now on the way the interview story was covered.
North Korea's position in the international community is what allows a film like this to be made in the first place. You would never see a film like this about China or Japan. And that's partly because North Korea doesn't have the international lobbying or the US domestic lobbying power to push back against something like this.
Coverage on this story was really getting in the way of a lot of real news that was occurring in North Korea at the time, and I think it was a shame really that the interview was really the leading world story for such a long time. It really obscured a lot of other news stories on North Korea.
Finally, time to give Rupert Murdoch credit where credit is due. In the aftermath of the Paris shootings, the media baron took to Twitter to say that until Muslims recognize and destroy what he called their growing jihadist cancer, they must be held responsible for it. In so doing, Murdoch managed to offend up to 1.6 billion Muslims in just 125 characters, which might be some kind of record. But here's the thing about Twitter. Rupert Murdoch doesn't own it, which means that unlike Fox News, he cannot control it. We end the show this week with a blowback compilation, just some of the many, many responses from the politically pointed to the parodies that followed Mr. Murdoch's latest adventures in Twitterland. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.